It's great to see everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Um, if you are new to my webinar, I wanted to welcome you and tell you just a few minutes about myself. As Kay might have mentioned, I am a high school history teacher. I teach AP European History and AP World History. This is my 14th year of teaching. I've taught in a variety of settings. I've taught in public school. I've taught in um, homeschool co-op, and for the past 5 years, I've been teaching online to high school students from all across the United States. So I'm super excited to have you all here. I see I have someone from Ontario. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat pod and tell me where you're coming from if you'd like. I live in West Virginia. I have my husband and I have 3 daughters and a beagle named Bella. And I'm super excited to bring our topic to you today. I love teaching in these webinars because unlike my AP history classes, I don't have to give you guys tests and quizzes, and I'm not trying to prepare you for the AP exam in May like I am my own students. So it's more of a fun, stress-free way for me to get to know other students from around the world and to talk about history. So I hope you guys are ready to go. Very cool. Okay. Nice. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. We are going to be talking, like I said, about, if you read in the introduction, we're going to be talking about rebirth and unrest. This is particularly looking at 1350 to 1453 in world and specifically European history, but we'll also focus to an extent on a little bit on world history today as well with the Ottomans. So if I share my screen like this, can I see you? Oh, snow. Have you all gotten snow yet? Nice. Oh man. Okay. Nice. Well, we're supposed to get snow actually tomorrow in my area, which is very exciting. Very good. All right. Well, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and put my chat pod like that. Can you guys still see my PowerPoint if I put it right there? Is that all right with you guys? Awesome. Great. Good deal. Okay, so like I said, we're going to be talking about actually quite a bit with these notes. So first of all, I want to talk about the Ottomans. So we'll talk about the Ottomans. Actually, we'll talk about them twice. We'll talk about them now and then also when we get to after we get through some European topics. So for the Ottomans, they're going to be conquering a lot of territory in this time frame, and it's going to mean an increase in land, an increase in power, in their empire building, in wealth, and their conquest is also going to mean a larger government, bureaucracy, army, all the things that that a group of people need to build an empire. Okay, if you almost think of in history building an empire like you would making a cake. What are the ingredients you need to make a cake? I don't know how many of you like to bake. I actually love to bake. What are the ingredients an empire needs in order to function and to grow in wealth and power and in territory? Well, the kinds of things they need, first of all, normally they need an army to conquer the land that they want. They need a strong government that can supply that army and can meet the needs of the people that they're acquiring, or force the people that they're conquering to pay taxes and tribute and things like that. They need a large bureaucracy oftentimes as well. So these are all of the ingredients to build an empire. And we're going to see how the Ottomans did that later on in our PowerPoint. Okay, and then we're also going to look at, let's see here. Make sure I'm on the right page here. Please forgive me. I want to pull my notes up here for a second. So yeah, in June of 1381, English peasants rose in a coordinated rebellion, and they protested and rioted against high taxes. We're jumping back to England right now. The Black Death continued to spread throughout Europe after the middle of the 1300s. And we're also going to see the influence of this huge drop in population. You guys remember, if you came to my webinar last time, we were talking about the Black Plague. Do you guys remember the other name for the Black Plague? Anyone know? It was called the Black Death or the bubonic plague. Yeah, Black Death was obviously it swept from Asia all the way to Europe. And for Europe, it was a disaster in terms of population. So all of the effects of this drop, this quick drop in population, is going to make for some interesting changes to the society of Europe. We're going to see actually that the few people who survive are actually going to have better lives, believe it or not, after this devastating, horrific pandemic. They're going to actually be able to have a little bit more arguing power with, especially like the lower classes. They're going to be able to argue for higher salaries, higher wages for their work. Oftentimes these were farm laborers. They're going to have a little bit more money to spend beyond just making sure they have food and clothing and shelter. And so interestingly enough, after the Black Plague, kind of standards of living increased in Europe. So we're going to see that this PowerPoint as well, which is interesting to think about. Okay. In the rural regions, yeah, less people, higher wages. Yeah, obviously during the Black Plague, they didn't think, it was necessarily better wages, but I mean, a better life at that time while the plague was spreading. But after the plague, that was an interesting impact on society. So in the rural regions, fewer peasants were left to work the land, and falling demand for grain allowed peasants who had survived the Black Plague to actually supplement their diet with other kinds of foods. So even before the Black Plague, this is an interesting fact. For those of you who enjoy food, like I do, I'm kind of a foodie. I love cooking and baking and coming up with new recipes for my family. So before the plague, people probably didn't have much variety. I'm talking about the majority of people who were peasants and pretty poor, okay? They probably relied on grain. Maybe once in a while they were able to have some vegetables thrown into the mix, depending on if they had time to keep a little side garden for their family. We don't even see the influence of things like the potato yet. The potato is actually something from the Americas, and during the Black Plague, it hasn't come to Europe yet. So their diet wasn't very interesting, if I can put it that way. But after the Black Plague, they had more money, that those who survived, they could negotiate for higher wages, and they were able to buy a little bit more in terms of the variety of foods. So I've heard some historians say that this time in history, after the plague, was actually one of the healthier times in history, in European history, in terms of what kinds of foods peasants could afford to eat, because they had a wider variety of foods to choose from. And if you know anything about health and nutrition, if you're interested in that, variety is good, right? You don't want to just only eat the same things over and over again. Our bodies need all kinds of nutrients. So eating different kinds of foods can be helpful. All right, how am I doing in the chat pod? I don't know. Good question, Jingshu. I don't know. Maybe. Okay. Oh, good. I've got some foodies in here. I've always said to my students, it would be so cool if I could teach a history class that used food to discuss the interactions between different cultures and trade, and how spices, where they've come from, and how they influenced a culture's food. I think that would be really neat, and it'd be really fun to be able to cook the food and eat it with my students. But it's hard to do that over the internet, so we'll have to just use our imaginations for now. In the cities, a lot of people were seeking better opportunities after the plague. So people actually moved from the countryside to the cities at this point, looking for work, and they were looking for new opportunities as well. So actually, after the plague, we also see the growth in towns. Towns found ways to organize and increase trade, as demonstrated. Maybe you've heard about the Hanseatic League. Has anyone ever heard of that in northern Germany? This was a way to, maybe you have, I don't know. It was a way to regulate trade amongst those people who were participants in the Hanseatic League, um, just to help everyone benefit economically. Oh, and real quick, the image, I don't know if you can you see the picture in the bottom right of this PowerPoint? It's this plaque, and this plaque is interesting. I'm going to post this in the chat pod. The plaque actually says, it's from Westminster Abbey in London, and it says, Dean Stanley records that beneath this stone are interred 26 monks of Westminster who died of the Black Death in 1348. This is crazy because it shows you, first of all, no one was immune from the Black Plague, right? And their medical knowledge was so poor at the time, they really didn't have any understanding as to how it spread. We know now, but one population that was really hard hit were monks and nuns, and people who worked in the Catholic Church, who were trying to visit the sick and the dying and give them their last rites. Last rites was something, maybe you've heard of it from the Catholic Church, where if you were on your deathbed, they would pray a prayer supposedly to help your soul make it to heaven after you died. And so because of that, sadly, a lot of those monks caught the plague and died, which is why I find it interesting, this plaque that you can read in Westminster Abbey. I know it's kind of hard to read in that image, but all right, so while peasants were rebelling in England, also there were popular revolts and rebellions in France and Italy. I think I mentioned to you earlier that there were actually rebellions in England. I mentioned it in the first slide, actually. Do you guys remember hearing about that? English peasants, this was June of 1381, English peasants rose in a coordinated rebellion. I'm going to put this in the chat pod so you can read along with me. They rose in a coordinated rebellion, and they were protesting and rioting against high taxes. The Black Death continued to spread throughout Europe, and depopulation, I think I already talked about that. But that rebellion isn't just going to happen in England. It's actually going to happen in other parts of Europe as well. So let's see here. Yeah, so while peasants were rebelling in England, there were also some popular rebellions in France and Italy. The upper crust of society, elites, were resisting demands of workers, which led to hundreds of different revolts. One revolt that occurred in France was called the Jacquerie Rebellion, and another one in Italy was called the Ciampi Rebellion. And that was that particular one, interestingly enough, was when workers seized control of the city. They demanded higher wages and more political representation. So we're seeing popping up around Europe, in England, France, and Italy, this theme of social and political unrest, which led to the growth in self-confidence in the village communities and even among city workers who were hoping to have a better life, to take advantage of the new economic conditions that seemed to be thriving after the plague. And then, do you remember me talking about the nobility of Europe, the aristocrats who owned a lot of the wealthy estates, and they had inherited their titles, oftentimes titles of privilege that would be recognized by the king or queen. I think I've mentioned this before. You guys remember? You guys with me here? I think we're getting off task. Well, if I was a better teacher, I'd come up with a segue from what you're talking about to the aristocracy of Europe. Maybe I'll think of one later. But anyway, those wealthy nobles resembled Europe's elites taking their wealth from the land, but some elites began to invest in trade, which created another pathway to get rich and to continue to get rich. Though at this time, interestingly enough, remember how I said that standards of living were higher after the Black Plague? We also see that the really, really rich in society, the landed nobles, they lived just far and above everyone else. They had lavish castles and mansions and through huge parties, and the spending that they could afford to do was staggering compared to everyone else. But then there were also chivalric orders at this time in European history. Do you remember learning about feudalism and the knight? And maybe you've heard of chivalry, the concept that men should be polite and serve the women in their midst, and treat them like a lady. That whole idea of chivalry comes from this time in European history. Um, yeah. So one thing that is interesting, though, during this time, I like to focus on literary trends. So this is actually going to be something that will hit closer to home for you guys, because how many of you guys love to get on Instagram or Snapchat or whatever it might be called that you like to use to be able to quickly talk to your friends? WeChat, sure. So that kind of quick communication and understanding, maybe sending memes or gifs or whatever, that actually is going to have a connection to what I'm about to tell you. At this time, we see literary trends developing after the Black Plague. We start to see a link between the vernacular language. Does anyone know what vernacular means? Anyone? Vernacular? Okay, here's vernacular. Vernacular is the language that the people of a region speak, okay? So oftentimes at this point in history, a lot of what was written in books and pamphlets was written in Latin or in a language that people didn't speak. Only the people who were upper crust, who had a really good education, could read. A lot of people were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. And so the cool thing for us today in terms of the connection here is people started to write in the vernacular, the everyday language that people spoke. And as soon as this happened, a huge population of citizens started reading and quickly understanding what they were reading. The impact of the use of vernacular language is huge. So imagine for a second having a strict classical education in which everything you read is written in the style of Shakespeare, for example. You guys have heard of Shakespeare. And keep in mind, Shakespeare did tend to write in not only the Elizabethan style, but also the everyday vernacular. But to our modern ears, if you go back and read Shakespeare today, it sounds really, really formal. It doesn't sound like the way you and I talk, okay? I'm just using him as an example here. But anyone in this day and age who has ever read even 2 or 3 lines of any Shakespeare story knows there's a certain level of decoding that must occur, right? We can't just immediately understand everything that Shakespeare said in one of his plays. We have to kind of interpret it and discuss it or look up some words that we might not know the definitions of. But in a sense, we modern age readers in 2021, we have to kind of translate Shakespeare's writings, don't we? Has anyone ever read any of Shakespeare's plays? Romeo and Juliet? What have you guys read? Even if you've read just a little bit. Okay, you've seen it in movies. Yeah, there's a lot of movies that have taken the themes from his plays and redone them. Romeo and Juliet. Okay. Okay. Oh, interesting. That's funny. Merchant of Venice. Okay, cool. All right. So anyway, if you've even read a few lines, you know you have to kind of translate what he wrote to understand what he means by it. But imagine for a second that a new form of writing develops based on our everyday use of devices and our everyday contact with our peers. A new author decides to write in the language of text speak or emojis or images and memes. Immediately, you're going to find yourself relating to the words or the pictures or the memes a lot more quickly without having to take the time to look up the meanings of words. Okay. Suddenly, as you're reading, stories and characters are going to come to life because the words are so much easier to understand, or the pictures or the memes. right? So that's kind of how it was when writers began using vernacular language. That's what it must have been like for people in Europe. Suddenly, stories and characters came to life. The people could relate and share with each other these new, exciting stories. Authors like Boccaccio wrote Decameron, and Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales, to name a few. Okay. So these were contemporary, they used contemporary language to their times to tell stories about, the failures and the comedy behind us crazy human beings, right? Especially because think of the fact that everyone's just survived in kind of an apocalypse of plague. So people are wanting to read and laugh and enjoy life after this, right? They've survived. So we also see this realism in the arts as well. Innovations in the use of oil paints developed, and medieval dramas and pageants showed the life and miracles of Christ. So these developments, I know it's strange to think about, but these developments were similar to Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, WeChat. A mass pop culture started to develop during this time, which we don't normally think about when we think about the 1300s and 1400s, but it's true. Okay, I want to tell a quick story about Geoffrey Chaucer. So while King Edward III was fighting the French during the 100 Years' War, and we'll talk about the 100 Years' War in a bit, Geoffrey Chaucer, the future father of English literature, was born. Chaucer was born into a family of prosperous wine merchants, and he grew a busy and very educated young man. In 1359, he actually served in the army of Edward III against France in the 100 Years' War. But he was actually captured during the battle and then held for ransom, and then later freed and returned to England. He then eventually served as a diplomat. He got married, and then he started writing. He started writing as he traveled around Europe, specifically when he traveled in Italy. I don't know how many of you have heard of Dante's Inferno, very, very famous piece of writing from this time in history. And so when he heard Dante's Inferno actually lectured on by Boccaccio, he started his literary career. After his second trip to Italy, he was given a position of comptroller of customs and lived in a rent-free house in Aldgate. And it's at this time that he started doing his most important writing. So the big thing you need to remember about Chaucer is his Canterbury Tales, excuse me. Typing it in the chat pod here. If you don't remember anything else, remember that Chaucer, the English poet, wrote the Canterbury Tales. Promise me that, okay? And then after 1389, he continued to serve the king and eventually leased a house in the garden of Westminster Abbey, the very famous church in London. It was there he planned to live the rest of his life, but he actually died 1 year after signing a 53-year lease agreement. But I like to mention him because if you've ever go to London and you make it to Westminster Abbey, he's actually buried in a place known as the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. So take the time, if you ever make it to London, to go over. Now that you know a little bit about Geoffrey Chaucer, and you should remember he wrote the Canterbury Tales, you can go to the Poets' Corner and see where he's buried. Can you guys see and still hear me, hear me okay? You doing all right? Who wrote the Canterbury Tales? Someone tell me. Geoffrey Chaucer. Awesome. Yes, very good. Just making sure you guys are alive. Yeah, oftentimes in history, war and fighting and battle, there's a lot of that, obviously, all throughout history. Oftentimes that's focused on the most. And we are going to focus a little bit on the 100 Years' War today because it is important to understand. But before we get there, we're going to talk about the Roman Catholic Church a little bit more, because at this time in history, in European history, the Roman Catholic Church was the church of Europe. It was hugely important. The Pope was the head of the Roman Catholic Church, and the Pope exercised a lot of power, not only over the church itself, which had, churches all over Europe that were underneath the Roman Catholic Church from Rome, but the popes oftentimes tried to exercise political power over the monarchs of Europe, over the kings and queens of Europe as well. And so there was constant tension between the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church in Rome and the kings and queens of Europe. Okay. So I want to tell you about a crazy time for the church related to the 100 Years' War and the Papal Schism, which is also known as the Great Schism. But what I want you to focus on is, I know you don't know anything about this story, but we're going to take a quick poll in the chat pod. I want to have you guys decide now who your team is going to be. You need to choose for this story, Team England, Team France, or Team Pope. I know you don't know anything about what I'm talking about, but hopefully at the end of my story, you can choose again and we'll see if your mind has changed. But you have to listen carefully in order to understand who you're going to choose at the end, okay? All right, so lots of people choosing England. Anyone for France or Pope? All right, so here we go. While I give the lesson, try to focus because I want you to understand what I'm talking about so you know who to choose at the end, okay? All right, so here we go. In the Provence region of France is an important river, the Rhone River, which during the period separated France from the north, France in the north from the merchant towns along the Mediterranean in the south. This is the location. This northern part of France is the location of Avignon and its palace, okay, pictured here on the slide. This special place became the seat of the Pope for 70 years when the Pope literally moved from Rome in Italy to France. This move was huge. It was not just the Pope and a few of his cardinals who moved. It was the entire papal court that moved from Rome in Italy to France, to Avignon, France, okay? So for 70 years, the Pope continued in this location. And over the course of those 70 years, the Pope weakened dramatically, particularly in the area of politics. Back in Rome, the papacy held strong political power. Whenever I say papacy, I'm referring to the Pope. But in Avignon, France, eventually that power weakened as the King of France continually surrounded himself with yes men and ostracized anyone else. So that move from Rome to France is actually going to weaken the Pope's power, okay? So the King of France was Philip the Fair, and he was a very politically strong king. Not only was he struggling with the church, but he was also fighting England for various reasons. One reason in particular was over property rights of a region called Aquitaine in the south, and he decided to weaken the power of the Pope by destroying this one particular group called the Knights Templar. Do you guys remember me telling you about the Knights Templar if you were at my webinar last time? That was a group that Philip the Fair decided to basically destroy. So Philip the Fair didn't just try to weaken Pope Clement V's power, but he struggled with Clement's predecessor, Boniface VIII. So in other words, way before he tried to destroy what he thought was the Pope's secret police, the Knights Templar, he already had been in a power struggle with the church. And like I said before, this is common to see the popes of the Roman Catholic Church struggling for power with the kings and queens of Europe, okay? So Boniface and Philip had been going at it for quite some time over who had rightful political power, the Roman Catholic Church or the crown of France, the King of France. And a series of nasty decrees went back and forth between the two until eventually Philip had Boniface, the Pope at the time, arrested, tortured, and then released. Can you believe that? The king literally had the Pope arrested, tortured, and released. But after his release, the Pope died from his wounds that he had received during torture. All this was over the question, who was in political control, the Pope or the King of France, okay? After Boniface died, and his successor, who only died a short time after election, the church and the new Pope, who was Clement V, had a political choice to make. Should the Pope stay in Rome? Now, listen carefully, this is important. Should the Pope stay in Rome or move the papacy to Avignon? Okay, that's the question on the floor here. Politically, the church took a chance moving the Pope to France. Rome was viewed as the seat of St. Peter, very important person in the church, and considered the founding city for the church itself. The church held geographic authority in Rome compared to Avignon, where the Pope had been weakened by the king. So even though the church did eventually weaken, there were some political benefits to staying in Avignon. England and France were increasingly moving towards war during the time of the Avignon papacy, and war does eventually break out. So politically, the church wanted to be near one of the kings, either France or England, while the war was imminent, should they need to quickly align with the victor to restore stability. In this context, around 1378, the new pope, a guy by the name of Gregory XI, decided to move the papacy back to Rome. This wasn't really controversial because the pope felt, it didn't have to stay in Avignon, and Rome was the place to be, right? Rome was considered the true seat of the papacy, since any pope was technically considered the bishop of Rome. Okay, so it made sense, move back to Rome. So the issue was the pope had been absent from Rome for 70 years, and the moral and geographic authority in Rome for 70 years, there was no pope there. That's an issue. So the move made sense to not only Gregory, but the church as a whole. So Pope Gregory moved back to Rome, died, and a new pope was elected. Unfortunately, that new pope was even weaker than the Avignon popes had been for those 70 years when the popes had lived in Avignon, France. So this situation is what will lead up to the Great Schism in the time of not one, not two popes, but three different popes, which is crazy to think about. Before this Great Schism, though, war broke out officially between England and France. England and France had essentially been at war since as early as 1066. And you guys remember hearing about the Battle of Hastings? What's the one thing students always remember about the Battle of Hastings? Can you guys remember? If you were there? Everyone always remembers what happened to poor Harold. What happened to him? Yeah. Arrow to the eye. Oh, and that wasn't what caused his death. He was actually killed much more brutally after that, but I won't talk about that. Anyway, so England and France are like two children fighting over toys. They are always fighting with each other, okay? So wars between England and France lasted well into the age of Napoleon, who ruled France in the early 1800s. So England and France are going to be kind of in and out of war constantly, all right? When in doubt, they're fighting. But one war turned the tide, rearranged the lands, and determined who had the most political and military might throughout the ages. That war was the 100 Years' War. So the 100 Years' War was, in fact, neither 100 years long, and nor was it just one war, okay? This is where historians got it wrong. It was over 100 Years' War, and it was actually a series of different wars. But historians at some point felt the need to kind of quantify and name this time in history, so they began calling it the 100 Years' War, and the name simply stuck. But it was actually 116 years long. At any rate, England's control of the province in France called Aquitaine and the Gascony region, along with the fact that English kings were considered vassals to the French kings, that means they were underneath French kings, resulted in a huge problem. This led to high tensions between the King of England and the King of France. So despite the fact that essentially the English kings were supposed to be vassals to France, England usually always held the upper hand, a fact that the French kings hated. So going back, the Capetian kings of France had ruled since the 10th century. In 1328, the last of the Capetian kings died. There was no longer a direct heir to the monarchy. Immediately after the death of the last Capetian king, members of both the French and English courts began breaking out the genealogies to see who had the best claim to the throne of France. It turned out that Edward III, King of England at the time, just so happened to have a strong claim to the throne. He was descended from the Capetians, and the genealogies actually supported this. The French, however, didn't agree and absolutely did not want an English king ruling the French throne, despite the fact that he actually was from the Capetian line. So the French quickly got out their own genealogy books and were like, no, the next king should be Philip VI, Philip of Valois. So what was interesting was that Edward III decided not to fight the French claim. Even though England had continually lost French lands all the way back to 1066 with the Battle of Hastings, Edward III bided his time and continued to rule only in England. In 1337, Philip took the throne, and in a move that will spark the war, he decided to reclaim the last vestiges of English-held territory in France, known as the Gascony region. Philip justified his move by claiming the English did not deserve the territories, since they had proven to be poor vassals and therefore deserved to lose those lands. At this point, Edward III decided that no more land would be lost to the French, so in 1337, the 100 Years' War began. England dominated most battles during the war because they had better weapons and superior military tactics. Before 1337, it was typical practice for armies to meet on a field, engage in all-out battle until one side dominated. However, from 1337 to 1360, England decided to change its tactics. Instead of sending hundreds of men onto the field to fight it out into the death, they decided to engage in a series of skirmishes instead. The English army would attack the French, retreat, attack again, retreat, and so on. This tactic was designed to demoralize the French army, and it certainly did. Also, England was dominating because they formed an alliance with Flanders. Flanders was strategically located on the continent, and it was an ideal place for the English to stage armies, store supplies, and quickly get their troops ready for battle. The two most significant battles during the 100 Years' War between 1337 and 1360 was the Battle of Crécy in 1346 and the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. So I want to just take a moment, since you guys have been so patient with me. I know we're not quite yet to do the poll again, but I just wanted to share with you briefly where we are here. Okay, so now we're getting to Flanders. Okay, Italy. All right, can you guys see this okay? Okay, so that was the kind of the causes leading up to, I was going to just briefly, Poitiers. Here we go. Okay. For some reason, it wasn't, here we go. Battle of Crécy. For just $67, you can make it. Okay. For some reason, it didn't preload like I wanted it to. Here we go. Battle of Crecy. Can you guys see this okay? How about now?
The Battle of Crecy took place. The French king.
Okay, for some reason that video is not coming through for you guys. I'm gonna just move on because for some reason this is not pulling up the video I had prepped. So my apologies. The show will keep going here. And I don't want to hurt your ears because that sounds like it is not a pleasant sound. Okay, so let's keep going. All right, so while the war was, can you guys hear me okay? All right, awesome. While the war was waging across several parts of Europe, as I've discussed, we have a series of peasant revolts from 1357 to 1358. In 1360, the French and English attempted to stop fighting in order to kind of regroup and heal. Peasant revolts in France were causing such internal problems that France was no longer able to deal with their external problems. A treaty was proposed designed to give France a chance to solve their own problems. So England and France agreed to the Treaty of Brittany, okay, pictured here on the screen. Although intentions were good, the treaty highly favored the English. So for example, the English were allowed to keep all the lands they had won up until that time. England was also freed from its vassalage responsibilities to France. And the only thing France got in return was the promise that an English king would never again make any claims towards the French throne. That's all they got. So for 9 years after the signing of the treaty, hostilities between England and France continued to build until 1369, the war resumed. A new king of England was on the throne, King Henry V. The king actually made famous by Shakespeare's play, Henry V. Maybe you've read it before or heard of it at least. Henry V decided to adopt a new technology in weaponry. For those of you who like weapons and military history, you'll find this interesting. He came up with the longbow, or he didn't come up with it, but he decided to adopt it for his armies, okay? So the longbow was a new type of weapon at the time, possibly invented in Wales, although its origins of its invention are not completely clear. But up until the adoption of the longbow, the main weapons of the armies were the short bow and the crossbow. Each of these bows had their disadvantages. With the short bow, knights often had to get really, really close to their enemies for the bow to be effective, which was dangerous. With the crossbow, once it was fired, it was very cumbersome to reload in tense situations. And you know, if you've seen any kind of movie depicting a battle, battles are very tense and stressful. So to have something that takes a long time to reload and get it ready to load isn't really all that helpful for being in the heat of battle. So the longbow solved all of these problems. It was easy to load and it could shoot from much farther away, keeping knights at a more safe distance from their enemies. And because of its velocity and speed, it was able to much more effectively pierce the army of your enemy compared to the short and crossbow. Nice. Okay. Good to know. Do you know what time in history the Minecraft crossbow is modeled after? Is it from the Middle Ages or any idea? It'd be cool to compare it and see like what they had in mind when they designed it for Minecraft. Not sure. Well, interestingly enough, a lot of the reproductions of a lot of these ancient battles are sometimes done with video game technology to show what it must have been like if they don't have reenactors who are willing to do it, which is, I think, is kind of cool. Okay, it's hard to reload. Good to know. So anyway, the French learned really quickly that they were no match for the English longbow. So Henry V of England was able to move from town after town on the on the continent of Europe, dominating each region he came in contact with on his way to Paris. That's the heart of France. That's where he was headed. In 1415, the Battle of Agincourt was won hands down by the English. The French lost so badly that the French king at the time, King Charles VI, decided to go against the Treaty of Brittany by allowing the English king to make claims towards the French throne. And Henry had every intention of taking the French throne. In fact, he even married the daughter of Charles VI to kind of make his claim to the French throne legit. But before Henry was able to declare himself king of both England and France, Charles and Henry died in the same year, 1422. Weird, huh? Died in the same year. Meanwhile, back in England, Henry's son and the rightful heir to the English throne, Henry VI, was only 9 months old, so he couldn't really do anything to take power in France. So the French throne remained in French hands, and France was able to finally enjoy a time of recovery. This is the interesting part that maybe you've heard a little bit about. This was about the same period of time in which Joan of Arc became the figurehead for French nationalism on the battlefield. Have you guys heard of Joan of Arc? Raise your hand if you have. Oh, come on. You guys have heard of Joan of Arc. Right. No one? You guys awake? Yes? One person has?
Okay.
Okay. All
First
right, great.
one is Hua Jun.
Okay. We good still? Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Hello?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, just making sure. Okay, so a few more minutes, I believe. So Joan of Arc believed that by taking back the city of Orleans and Reims from the English, France could start to win the war. So the French armies made a hero out of Joan, and they followed her lead, even though she was a teenager at the time, which is fascinating to think about. So in 1453 or 1431, excuse me, you can see her pictured on the slide here. Joan of Arc, despite her hero status amongst the French, was actually burned at the stake with the support of the English, who accused her of being a witch. In the same year, and by this time in the war, France, who had finally had some time to recover, held a standing army, which was not usual for the time. Normally, nations didn't have standing armies. So while France was building its army, the English were experiencing their own internal problems, dealing with the issues with the parliament and taxation. And that kind of tied them up. So the English ultimately, here's the end of the story, will lose every bit of territory in France with the exception of Calais. And in the end, England was able to keep Calais all the way up to 1558. But that is another story. So that kind of ends our discussion of the 100 Years' War. Okay, so to round things out here, we need to go back to the Roman Catholic Church and the Great Schism. Do you guys remember the team that you chose? Team France, Team England, or Team Pope? Hopefully you still remember who you chose. Okay, so the power of the church rested in the hands of the Pope. You guys remember that, who was considered the Bishop of Rome. Popes tended to reside in the Vatican in Rome. And then you remember that 70-year period of popes living in Avignon, France, really threw everything off, okay? And interestingly enough, in this time, the cathedral was where the Pope made all of his important decisions, okay? So the Pope sat and conducted church business in their cathedral, okay? And you can see San Giovanni in Laterano pictured here on the slide from Rome. So the Vatican, that was the seat of the church, and the cathedral was really significant for the Pope. The Lateran Church is special because it's in this church that the body of Pope Martin V is laid to rest. Martin V was known for restoring the Pope and the papacy back to normal after the time of the Great Schism. And if you don't remember anything else about what I'm telling you, remember that the Great Schism was a time when there were 3 different people who claimed to be the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. And that is unheard of. There's always only ever been one man at one time who serves as the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, okay? So it's important to understand that we pick up our story that Pope Gregory the 11th moved the Pope from Avignon back to Rome. Remember that guy in 1378? And that move should have strengthened the Pope's power. But within 1 year after moving from Avignon back to Rome, Pope Gregory died, okay? This left the church, particularly the College of Cardinals, who were supposed to help elect a new pope, they now had the tough job of electing a new pope. But keep in mind, even though the pope was moved back to Rome, much of the papal entourage was actually born in France, not in Italy, okay? So that's going to mean that there's going to be some issues amongst the people back in France and the people in Italy over who should be the next pope. You can kind of see where I'm headed here. So the cardinals eventually elected an Italian pope, a guy named Pope Urban VI, but he was really unpopular amongst both Italians and the French. French cardinals elected a new pope by the name of Clement VII. Clement VII decided to move the papacy once again back to Avignon, back in France. When this move was made, a schism occurred because Urban had no intentions of stepping down, and therefore there were officially 2 popes in the church. One in Rome and Italy, and one in Avignon, France. Okay, hopefully you're following. This is when there were 2 popes. That's not okay. So the issue now is that a lot of the kings and rulers around Europe were like, okay, who should we call pope? This is a huge deal. We need to know. And, you know, no one knew what to do. So the other issue was that the way to resolve this was going to be for one pope to die, basically. They needed for one pope to die and then the other pope to just be the pope. That would solve everyone's problems, right? But ultimately, this tactic isn't going to work for reasons I'm about to explain. So in 1394, while the 100 Years' War was raging, Urban VI died. Instead of simply shifting loyalty to Clement VII, which I just said would have been the easiest thing to do, the Roman cardinals elected a new pope back in Rome, Boniface IX. And when Clement VII died, instead of loyalties shifting to Boniface, the French cardinals too elected a new pope, Benedict XIII. So no one is doing what should be done. No one is just saying, okay, our pope died, now the guy over here is pope, or now the guy over here is pope. They're not doing that. They're just electing new popes in France and in Rome. Not okay, right? So the other issue is ultimately that in order to solve the problem, a new council is formed and a new pope in Pisa in Italy is elected. His name was Alexander. So at this point, there are 3 popes. 3. They just need to stop, okay? So yeah, ultimately, the Pisa Council, rather than solving the problem of the schism, made it much worse, right? At this point in history, a powerful prince in Germany demanded another council to end the schism once and for all. This council, known as the Council of Constance, basically simply voted his way. They decided to elect a new pope. And ultimately, this Pope John the 22nd thought everyone would vote for him, but they didn't. So they elected at the Council of Constance. This is where the story ends, I promise. Martin V is elected, and he's the Pope buried in the Lateran Cathedral, pictured on the previous few slides ago in Rome, San Giovanni in Laterano. The council decided to meet more frequently than in the past, even annually if possible, in order to prevent this kind of craziness from ever happening ever again, okay? And then this idea of conciliarism, I'm not going to mention that too long because you guys don't have to take the AP exam, but that is another term that we associate with this time in European history. Okay, almost done here. So we're going to see if your mind has changed. So now that we've covered the 3 historical case studies, it's time to vote again. Who do you think was the victor or the dominant player during this period? Team England, Team France, or the popes? England? France? Interesting. I've got everyone saying different things. England forever. All right, you think maybe Pope Martin. What about Pope Martin V? I think he would probably win it, right? Well, you guys have been awesome. The last bit I just want to mention briefly, because we're almost out of time here, is about the rise of the Ottoman Empire. And I think we will be discussing this a little bit in my next webinar, which is coming up end of February. I hope you guys can come for that. But the one thing that I always like to tell students for this is, if you don't remember anything else about the Ottoman Empire, remember that the Ottoman Turks are going to attack the city of Constantinople in 1453, and they lay siege to the city and destroy it, and they take it over. And that is going to be the fall of what had been a very wealthy and powerful capital for the Byzantine Empire from previous centuries. But that's going to be a very important date, because that's kind of the beginning of the expansion of the Ottoman Empire in not only in the Middle East, but Southeastern Europe, a little bit of Africa, and a little bit of Asia too. The Ottomans are known for quite a bit of important things. So we're going to be discussing this in more depth. Again, like I said, in the webinar to come at the end of the month in February. But I think I am just about out of time. You guys have been awesome today. Are there any questions on, I know I didn't really cover the Ottomans, but we talked about a lot. We talked about the end of the Black Plague, Geoffrey Chaucer. We talked about the 100 Years' War, the Great Schism, the Avignon Papacy. Are there any questions from anyone?
Hi.
Hi, Jason.
You told me that Geoffrey
Chaucer.
He served as the 9th secretary, right?
Well, he had a number of different jobs.
Yes, and what is the 9th secretary?
Let's see. I'm trying to think of what you're thinking of. So he was the oh, I think I know what you're talking about. Are you talking about when I mentioned that he was the comptroller of customs and subsidy of wools, skins, and hides? That job?
Yes, and he was the 9th secretary, and I don't understand what that job is.
Yeah, so in my notes, I don't have anything about that in particular. I do know that he I'd have to look that one up. In my notes, I have his career as a as a soldier during the 100 Years' War. He worked for the king. He was sent as a diplomat to Italy. He served as a comptroller for a bit. Yeah, I'd have to look that up. That's a really good question, Jason.
Hi.
Hi, Brandon.
Oh, so I would like to ask a question. You talked about the Black Death in the beginning of the class, and I was really interested in whether if the people died from the Black Death and how would they processing their dead bodies to make the virus not spreading others.
That's a really good question. So believe it or not, villages and towns did what they could in terms of record keeping. They didn't have a lot of knowledge in terms of how the plague was spread. At this point in history, a lot of people were superstitious, and they thought even if you looked at someone in the eyes who had it, you would catch it. But as we know, that's not the case. It was spread through contact with the person, through, much like coronavirus is spread today. But it was, I believe they did do their best to, in some cases they did force people to stay in their homes through like very strict quarantines. They also tried to bury dead bodies as quickly as possible to prevent from spreading. Apparently, the Pope even was constantly surrounded by fire. Like they had him sit around a bonfire for much of the time just to ensure that he wouldn't get it, and he never did. But yeah, they did a variety of different things to try and keep it from spreading. Unfortunately, a lot of times people moved out of their village if the plague came to their village. But what they didn't realize is oftentimes when they moved to try and get away from the plague, they spread the plague. So very good question. Thank you for asking. All right. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for a great class.